The laundry at Thornvale was always the last place anyone thought to look. It sat at the edge of the estate grounds proper, a low stone building that smelled of lye and wet wool, and the particular gray steam that rose from the copper vats in all seasons. The maids who worked there were invisible in the way that working women are invisible inside great houses, present in all the evidence of their labor, and absent from any account of it. They moved through the corridors early and left before the family descended for breakfast. Their hands told the story of their mornings, red and cracked at the knuckles, but no one looked at their hands. Nell Perry had worked the laundry at Thornvale for 3 years. She was 22 years old, slight and careful, with the kind of face that people forgot as soon as she left a room, and the kind of mind that forgot nothing. She had come to the estate after her father died, a schoolmaster in the village of Wending, whose books she had read cover to cover by the time she was 14, and whose debts had left her nothing but her own 2 hands. She did not resent the work. She resented what the work confirmed about the world's arithmetic, which was that a woman with a good mind and no money was worth exactly what her hands could produce, and no more. She was not thinking about any of that on the morning of the 14th of November. She was thinking about the starch quantities for the Duke's table linen, which had been increased by order of the steward, Mr. Metter, out as Pembridge for the forthcoming gathering of family solicitors. She carried her ledger into the passage beside the estate office to cross-reference the counts against the household supply list, and she was 2 steps into the passage before she understood what she was hearing through the partially closed door. Mr. Pembridge was not alone. She did not hear the other man's voice clearly. She heard Pembridge's, which was precise and unhurried and carried the authority of a man who has managed a large estate for 19 years. And learned to speak as though his own pronouncements were simply the natural law of the place. He said the words she was never supposed to hear. He said them twice, patiently, with a kind of procedural satisfaction, as though explaining the order of operations in a recipe that had already been tested. The late Duke's will, as written and held by the London solicitors, would leave the secondary estate at Colford to the Duke's younger sister, Miss Wren Ashford. A document was to arrive in advance of the family meeting. That document was not the original. That document had been altered. Nell stood in the passage and did not breathe. She heard the sound of a chair pushed back. She moved. She was around the corner and into the narrow alcove behind the linen cupboard. Before the door opened, her ledger pressed to her chest, her heart so loud she was certain it could be heard in the passage. She waited. She heard footsteps. She heard the outer door of the estate office close. She stood in the alcove for a long time after. If you have ever known something you wished you did not know, you will understand what happened in the next several minutes. She understood, very precisely, what she had heard. She also understood what would happen if she said it aloud to the wrong person. She was a laundress. Aldous Pembridge had been steward of Thornvale for 19 years. He kept the household books, managed the staff, countersigned every supply order she had ever submitted. The hierarchy of the estate ran through him as surely as it ran through the Duke himself. If she spoke without being believed, she would be dismissed before the afternoon light failed. She took the longer route back to the laundry and said nothing to anyone. If you have stayed with a story like this before, you know what it costs a woman to know something and wait. Stay close. This particular waiting does not last long, and what comes of it matters. She did not tell anyone that day, or the day after. She told herself she was deciding. She was not deciding. She was afraid. She counted over it in the evenings, lying in the small room she shared with 2 other laundry maids, turning the words she had heard. The way she turned a piece of linen against the light, looking for a seam she might have misread. She found no seam. Pembridge had been explicit. He had spoken to someone who had agreed with him. The document was already in preparation. The solicitors were to arrive in 5 days. On the 3rd evening she got up and washed her face and told herself a plain thing, which was that the Duke's young sister had never done anything to deserve being robbed of what her father had intended for her, and that her own fear was not a sufficient reason for letting it happen. This was not courage. It was arithmetic. Her father had taught her arithmetic. She had no way to speak to the Duke directly. She was a laundress. The formal channels of the house ran downward from the steward, which meant they ran through the man she was trying to accuse. The housekeeper, Mrs. Fowle, was a careful woman who had worked alongside Pembridge for a decade, and who would, Nell understood with certainty, first confirm the account with Pembridge before carrying it further. That path was closed. There was one other path. The Duke rode every morning, early. Before the household fully woke, he came back through the stable yard at the back of the estate, which abutted the laundry wall. Nell had seen him often enough from the laundry window, a figure in a dark coat on a bay horse, moving at a collected trot along the estate lane. She had never spoken to him. He had never looked toward the laundry windows. That was the ordinary arrangement. On the fourth morning, she went to the stable yard and she waited. The November air was gray and cold, and she stood with her hands folded in her apron and her breath visible. And she waited. She heard the horse before she saw him, the particular rhythm of a good horse held to a collected pace rather than pushed. The Duke of Thornvale came around the curve of the estate lane and saw her standing in the yard, and he did not slow down. Immediately. She watched him register her, a working woman in an apron and worn shoes in a place where working women did not ordinarily wait to intercept a duke on horseback. And she watched him make the decision to pull up. He was 34 years old. She had not known precisely how old he was before this moment, but she was close enough now to see the lines at the corners of his eyes, and to note that the line across his left eyebrow was not a natural crease, but His face was the kind of face that did not offer expressions as gifts. He looked at her in silence, and the horse stood still beneath him, and the estate grounds behind him held the particular silver-gray light of a November morning without sun. "Your Grace," she said, because that was the only place to begin. He waited. He did not ask who she was. He seemed to understand that she was going to tell him something, and that the telling required her to get there in her own order. She told him. She was plain about it, because there was no other way to be plain about a thing like this. She told him where she had been standing, and what she had heard, and the specific words she remembered. She told him that she understood what she was risking in saying it. She told him she had waited 3 days, and that the solicitors arrived in 2, and that she did not have more time. He listened without interrupting. He sat on his horse with his hands quiet on the reins, and he listened to her the way she had not been listened to since her father died, which was with the full weight of a person who is not deciding whether the speaker is worth attending to, but simply attending. When she finished, there was a silence. The horse shifted its weight. She held still. "Your name," he said. His voice was level with no rise in it. "Nell Perry. Your Grace." "The laundry." He nodded once, a short, clear gesture, and he said, "Go back to your work, Miss Perry. Go back and say nothing to anyone." It was not a dismissal. She knew the difference. She went back to the laundry. She could not have said how she knew, but she knew he had believed her. What she did not know, as she stood over the copper vat and worked the paddle through the Duke's table linen, was what had happened to the Duke in the second year of his tenure when he had trusted Pembridge implicitly with a land dispute in the northern quarter of the estate, and how that dispute had resolved in a way that had quietly benefited Pembridge and cost a family of tenant farmers their lease. The Duke had not known it at the time. He had found out 2 years later, in a set of accounts reviewed by a London auditor, and the knowledge of it had stayed with him ever since, a specific cold point in the machinery of the estate, that he had never had sufficient ground to act upon. He had inherited Pembridge along with the title, and the entanglement of the two had made the steward difficult to dislodge, without evidence that was more than suspicion. He had, in other words, been waiting for exactly this. Without knowing he had been waiting. He said nothing of this to anyone. He sent a message to his London solicitors that afternoon, requesting that the sealed copy of his father's will be held at their offices and not released to any courier or proxy until the Duke himself or his personal secretary arrived to receive it. He made this request without explaining the reason. He was a duke. No reason was required. He also sent for the man who had kept his father's household accounts, a retired clerk named Bartley, who had left the estate upon the old Duke's death and was now living in the village of Wending. Bartley arrived the following evening. The Duke received him in the library with no one else present, and showed him the estate account books from the past 3 years. Bartley sat with those books for 2 hours and found 4 things. What he found was a set of preparation costs, small amounts, carefully distributed, charged to household maintenance and staff wages, that did not correspond to any actual maintenance or any actual staff member. Amounts that were taken together, consistent with what it would cost to engage a document forger in London. The Duke looked at these accounts for a long time. The solicitors were due the following day. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the library with the accounts and with the sealed letter Bartley had left him, which was a detailed notation of the discrepancies in Pembridge's hand, and he thought about the specific arithmetic of what he was about to do. Pembridge had 19 years of the estate's confidence behind him. The family solicitors who were coming had worked with Pembridge directly, had depended on his account of the estate's condition at every year-end review. If the Duke accused Pembridge openly without sufficient ground, without the original will in hand to place beside the altered document, Pembridge had enough established trust in this house to make the accusation look like a misunderstanding at best and a young Duke's paranoia at worst. He needed the laundress. He also needed her to be believed, which was a different thing. He was at the laundry door before the household was properly awake. He came without a footman and without prior announcement, which was the kind of breach of the ordinary arrangement that made Mrs. Fowle's eyebrows go up when she saw him cross the yard. He knocked at the laundry door with the same knock he would have used at a study door. Nell opened it. She looked at him across the threshold, and he could see, precisely, that she had not expected him to come to her. "I need you to repeat what you told me," he said, "in the presence of my solicitor and one other witness. I need you to do it this morning." She looked at him steadily. She said, "They will say I misheard." "Yes," he said. "That is why I need you to be precise." There was a pause, the kind of pause in which a person takes account of what they are about to step into. She untied her apron. "Give me a moment to tell Mrs. Hopkins. I will be away from the vat," she said. He waited. He was aware, standing at the laundry door, that this was not a usual arrangement and that it would be remarked upon. He did not find that it concerned him particularly. She came back in 3 minutes. She had taken off the apron and smoothed the front of her gown, and she looked exactly like what she was, a working woman in a plain dress who had decided to walk directly into the machinery of a great house and speak the things she had heard. He thought of the riding crop his steward kept in the office, not for horses, but for emphasis, and of the 4 figures in the account book, and he felt something that was not anger so precisely, but was close enough to it to require management. He said, "Walk with me." She walked with him in the library, with the solicitor, Mr. Cray, and with his own secretary, a young man named Bassett, who was trusted absolutely. She repeated what she had heard in the passage outside the estate office. She was word perfect. She had a schoolmaster's daughter's memory, which is to say she had learned to listen for the exact order of words, rather than the impression of them, and she gave the exact order now. To Cray, who was a careful and undemonstrative man of 50, listened with his hands folded on the table, and asked her 2 questions when she finished. One about the precise position of the door, and one about the voice she had not recognized clearly. She answered both questions without embellishment. Cray looked at the Duke. The Duke put Bartley's notation on the table beside the account books. There was a silence. "The will itself," Cray said. "Held in London," the Duke said. "I sent word yesterday. It has not left your offices." Cray looked at the account books for a long time. He looked at Bartley's notation. He looked at the woman sitting across the table from him, who was wearing a working dress, and who had laid out the evidence in the same plain, direct order that a trained clerk would have used. "I will need the document that was to arrive today," he said. The Duke said, "Yes." The document arrived with the courier at 11 o'clock. Cray examined it beside the will he had retrieved from London by express the previous evening, which his junior clerk had ridden through the night to obtain, and the comparison took him 40 minutes. When he emerged from the study, His face had the particular set of a man who has confirmed something he hoped he would not confirm. Pembridge was in the East Wing at that hour, supervising the arrangement of chairs for the family meeting. He did not know, when the Duke walked into the East Wing with Cray and Bassett, that the laundress had spoken. He saw the three of them cross the threshold, and he did what men of his type do when faced with something unexpected, from a position of long-established confidence, which was to reset his expression to the professional neutral that 19 years had made natural. He said, "Your Grace," with the same slight bow he had used every morning for those 19 years. The Duke said, "Mr. Pembridge, I require a conversation." Pembridge looked at the solicitor. Pembridge looked at the Duke. Something passed behind his narrow, pale eyes. Not panic yet, but the rapid reassessment that precedes panic. "Of course," he said. "Shall we use the study?" "No," the Duke said. "Here will do." The family meeting had brought the Duke's aunt, Lady Constance Ashford, and her son, the Honourable Gerald Ashford, down from Derbyshire the previous afternoon. They were present in the East Wing. The Duke's sister had arrived that morning and was sitting in the window seat at the far end of the room with a book she was not reading. There were 2 additional witnesses in the room, both Cray's junior clerks, who had come prepared. This was not an accident. The Duke had arranged the room for exactly the number of people it contained. Pembridge understood this approximately 3 seconds after the Duke said, "Here will do," which was long enough for Lady Constance to have looked up from her embroidery and for Miss Ashford to have set down her book. It was not long enough for him to do anything useful with the understanding. Cray set both documents on the table. He explained, in the professional language of a solicitor who has done this before, what the examination had revealed. He was precise and did not editorialize. He named the specific alterations which had removed a single line of bequest and substituted a different heir, and he identified the characteristics of the substituted handwriting, which did not match the notarial style of the original document's final clauses. Lady Constance said, "I do not understand." "Gerald Ashford," said Pembridge. "What is this?" Pembridge said nothing. His hands were very still at his sides. He was at this particular moment already calculating, which was the quality of his mind that had served him for 19 years, and which now served him only in the way that it clarified the shape of what had gone wrong. Someone had heard him. There was no other explanation for the locked-down original, the summoned solicitor, the careful arrangement of witnesses. He looked at the room with a quick measuring look, and his gaze landed on the Duke, and the Duke did not look away. "Miss Wran Ashford," the Duke said without raising his voice, "the estate at Colford was left to you by your father. That bequest is confirmed. Mr. Cray will arrange the formal transfer at the appropriate time." She stood up slowly from the window seat. She was 19 years old and small, and had the particular stillness of someone who has been afraid for several weeks without being certain of what they were afraid of. She said, "It is confirmed. It is confirmed," the Duke said. Pembridge was escorted from the East Wing by Bassett. He left with his hands still at his sides, and his face composed into something that might have been dignity and was not quite. Cray remained to manage the documentation. Lady Constance sat down with a sound that was not quite speech. The room was quiet. Miss Ashford crossed the room and stood in front of her brother. She did not have many words for the particular relief of a thing you had begun to doubt arriving intact after all. So she put her hand briefly on his arm and said nothing, and he put his hand over hers for a moment. She was not in the East Wing. She was back at the laundry. She had gone back without being told to, because the Duke's secretary had come for her when the meeting was concluded, and said simply that she might return to her work, and she had understood from his face that the thing had held. She stood at the copper vat and worked the paddle and let herself breathe in the particular slow way of a person from whom a weight has been set down. She did not expect anything further. She had been the tool that opened the lock. The lock was open. The world would resume its ordinary arrangement, which was that the Duke of Thornvale made decisions for Thornvale, and the laundress washed the Duke's table linen, and those 2 facts would continue without intersection. She had done what arithmetic required. She had told the truth and been believed. That was more than she had expected when she stood in the stable yard that November morning, and she was determined to find it sufficient. She was at the vat for 20 minutes before she became aware that someone was standing in the laundry doorway. It was the Duke. He did not come in. He stood at the threshold in his dark coat, with his hands at his sides, and looked at her across the copper vat, and the steam, and the smell of lye, and she looked back at him with the paddle still in her hands, and there was a moment between them that was not any category of thing she had a word for. "The estate at Colford is secured," he said. "I am glad of it," she said. He looked at her. His face did not offer this as an expression, but she thought she saw, at the outer corner of his left eye, the particular tightening that happens in a person who is choosing their words with more than ordinary care. "I have been looking," he said carefully, "for a person with a specific set of qualities in the management of the estate household accounts. The position is called Secretary of Household Records. It has not previously existed at Thornvale. It would require literacy, numeracy, and the capacity to observe and retain information accurately." A pause. "I understand that you read." Nell set down the paddle. She said, "My father was a schoolmaster. He said, 'I was told.'" She looked at him across the steam. She thought in the way you think things when you are 22 years old and have spent 3 years learning to keep what you think behind your face. That this was a man who had looked at the world's arithmetic and decided to revise it, and that this was the rarest thing she had encountered in her life. She said, "I would need to understand what the position entails." "Yes," he said. "That is a reasonable requirement." He stepped inside the laundry threshold, the first time she had seen him inside that particular doorway, and he said, "Sit down, Miss Perry, and I will tell you. If you have stayed this far, leave a word below for Nell. She earned it." She sat down. He pulled up the low stool that was the only other seat in the laundry and sat across from her and explained the position with the same level directness she had come to understand was simply his manner, no warmth withheld and no warmth performed. He told her what the records required, how the household expenditure needed a second set of careful eyes, now that the steward's role would be divided and restructured, and what the wage would be. The wage was 3 times what she earned at the vat. She listened with her hands in her lap and the steam moving past them both, and she thought about her father's arithmetic and about what it had cost her to stand in the stable yard on a November morning and wait for a horse she had no way of knowing would stop. She said, "I accept the position." He nodded. He stood up from the stool, and he looked at her once more with those still gray eyes, and she had the sense, not yet fully formed, that he was looking at her in the way that the world had decided not to, and that this was a quality of attention that had no casual name. He said, "Good morning, Miss Perry. Good morning, Your Grace." He left. She stayed seated for a moment, and then she stood up and washed her hands and went to tell Mrs. Hopkins, which she had been looking forward to, in a small and well-contained way. For the past 3 years, the winter came in hard after the Colford settlement. There was an early frost that glazed the estate grounds and made the lanes to the village impassable by carriage for a week in December. Nell moved into the small parlor off the household office, which had a writing desk and a good fire and 2 east-facing windows that let in the morning light before the rest of the house woke. And she learned the household accounts from the ground up, sitting with Bartley 3 afternoons a week and with the records themselves every other morning. She was not, in this new arrangement, invisible in the ordinary way. She was not precisely visible either. She existed in the particular in-between state of a person who has crossed a threshold but not yet arrived at the other side of it. The footmen were polite to her, in the careful way of people uncertain how to calibrate a new thing. Mrs. Fowle was warmer than she had expected, which told Nell something about what Mrs. Seck. Fowle had thought of Pembridge, and had never said aloud. The new understeward, a young man named Mr. Gaw. Cass, who had come from Cray's recommendation, was openly grateful for her grasp of the laundry supply records, which were the only records in the house that were in perfect order. The Duke was in residence through December. He was not often in the household office. When he was, he asked her specific questions and listened to the answers with the same complete quality of attention she had learned to recognize, and she answered in the same plain order she used for everything else, and they were both, she thought, most comfortable in this arrangement. It required nothing from either of them, beyond accuracy and honesty, and those were things they both had in quantities. The world had not particularly rewarded until now. On the Thursday of the second week of December, she was late leaving the office because the supply returns had been miscounted by the kitchen, and she had been reconciling the discrepancy. The house was very quiet. She went down the back corridor toward the stair and past the library and saw through the partially open door that the Duke was there. He was not reading. He was sitting in the chair beside the fire with a glass of port that he was not drinking, and he was looking at the portrait above the mantelpiece, which was of the old Duke, his father, in the style of the previous decade. He was not aware of her in the passage. She watched him for only a moment. It was not a comfortable thing to see. The particular expression of a man in a private moment he did not know was witnessed, which was a kind of grief that had been managed so long it had become a posture rather than a feeling. She knew grief managed into a posture. She knew what it looked like from the outside and what it cost from the inside. She had worn it herself for 2 years after her father died. She did not go in. She went to her room. The Takesford deemed. She thought about it. She thought about the scar over his eyebrow and the flat, still quality of his gaze that she had initially read as coldness and had slowly learned to read as something else, which was the expression of a person who had decided that feeling things openly in public was a kind of expenditure they could not afford. She thought about the way he said her name, which was the way you say a name when you have had occasion to think about the person it belongs to and have chosen not to show it. She was 22 years old. She was not inexperienced in self-deception. She told herself she was noting these things in the way that she noted. All things which was for accuracy, not for any purpose of her own. She noted them very carefully. In the third week of December, Miss Ashford came back to Thornvale for Christmas. She was small and warm and had a particular habit of crossing a room directly to whoever she wanted to speak to, without the social circling that most people used, and she had apparently decided that she wanted to speak to Nell. She came to the office on the second morning, closed the door behind her, sat down across the desk, and looked at Nell with the frank open gaze of someone who has decided to proceed without preamble. "You are the woman who told my brother about the will," she said. "I am," Nell said. She looked at her for a moment. She said, "I want to understand something. You heard that alone, and you waited 3 days, and then you went and stood in the stable yard in November to intercept a duke on horseback." "Yes," Nell said. "Were you afraid?" "Yes." Miss Ashford was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My brother does not use the word trust easily. He used it about you. I thought you should know that." Nell looked at the account book in front of her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not be in some way too much or too little. She seemed satisfied with the silence. She stood up and said, "I will let you work," in a tone that suggested she would be back, and left. Nell sat with the account book and the fire and the December light through the east windows and the specific knowledge that she was not, in fact, managing herself as well as she had thought. Christmas at Thornvale was quieter than Nell had expected for a great house. There were no grand entertainments, no ball, no formal dinner with 40 covers. There was the family, which was the Duke and Wren and Lady Constance, who had stayed on through December, and there was the household, and there was the particular quality of a great house in winter, when the social machinery has been suspended, and the people inside it are simply people. On Christmas Eve, the Duke came to the office at an hour when she had not expected him. She was finishing the year-end reconciliation, her shoulders aching from the cold, and she looked up when the door opened and found him standing in the doorway with 2 small items in his hand. One was a pair of wool gloves. Not fine ones. Working gloves, warm ones, the kind that would survive the laundry yard. The other was a small volume, pocket-sized, bound in brown leather, which she recognized from the title on the spine as a text on accounting methods that Bartley had mentioned, and that she had not been able to obtain. He set them on the desk in front of her. He looked at her hands, which were, she was aware, the hands of a woman who had spent 3 years at a laundry vat, red at the knuckles and marked by the work. "The gloves are practical," he said. "The book is for interest." She looked at the gloves and the book, and then at him. She said, "You chose these yourself." It was not quite a question. He did not deny it. "I was advised," he said, "to give you a length of silk or a brooch." I concluded that the advice was not specific to the recipient. Nell looked at the wool gloves and felt something that was not gratitude precisely, but was in the same family, a warm and slightly undisciplined thing that she was not sure she had the authority to feel. She said, "Thank you, Your Grace." He looked at her with those gray eyes, level and still, and she thought she saw, very briefly, something that the stillness usually covered, which was that he was standing in the office doorway at 8:30 on Christmas Eve, with wool gloves and an accounting text because the alternatives had not been specific to her, and he had found that he minded. He said, "Good night, Miss Perry." He left. She sat with the gloves in her hands for a longer time than was strictly necessary. The year turned cold into January, and with the new year came a letter from the Court of Chancery regarding the disposal of Pembridge's case, which Cray had proceeded with, on the strength of the evidence Bartley had documented, and the forged document itself. The letter confirmed the outcome Cray had anticipated. Pembridge would not stand in any county's household again. The matter was closed. The Duke showed Nell the letter across the office desk, not because it was her concern professionally, but because she had made it possible, and he was, she had learned, a man who paid his debts in the same plain arithmetic with which he calculated everything else. She read it once. She handed it back. She said, "Miss Ashford's estate is fully secured." "Fully," he said. She nodded. There was a silence between them, the kind that had become familiar over the winter months, a silence that was not absence but a kind of held attention. Two people in the same room with the same quality of awareness of the fact. He said, "Nell." It was the first time. She looked up. He did not say anything else immediately. He looked at her from across the desk with the particular expression she had stopped trying to categorize, because it was not cold and it was not warm in any simple way. It was the expression of a man who has decided that something is true and is deciding whether to say it aloud. She thought about the laundry doorway, and the stable yard and the wool gloves, and the way he listened. She said, "Julian, his name." She had not used it before. She watched the effect of it on his face, the very small and complete change that happened in the set of his eyes. He said, "I would like to ask you something." "Ask it," she said. He asked it. She looked at the fire, and the window, and the account books, and the wool gloves folded on the corner of the desk, and she thought about arithmetic, and courage, and the specific cost of standing in a cold stable yard and waiting for a horse to stop. She said, "Yes, the world would say a great many things about this. The world would take a while to arrange itself into a position it could defend. Lady Constance would require a month, and 2 cups of tea, and a conversation with Cray about the legal position before she said, with the compressed precision of a woman who has recalculated and found the figures tolerable, that at least the girl had a head for numbers. Miss Ashford would say nothing at all, but would come directly across the room and take Nell's hands in both of hers for a long moment. The household would adjust as households do, in the particular gradual way of a large mechanism absorbing a new arrangement. None of that happened yet. What happened first was January, cold and bright, and the east windows in the office full of morning light, and a man sitting across a desk from a woman who had chosen to tell a hard truth to someone with the power to believe it or dismiss it, and who had been believed. That winter she wore the wool gloves to the stables every morning because she had kept up the habit of early mornings, even now that she had no laundry vat to attend. The Duke still rode at dawn. She no longer stood in the yard waiting. She stood at the fence line where the estate lane curved, and sometimes she walked with him when he came back, along the lane with the frost still on the grass and the gray sky turning to gold above the stone walls of Thornvale, and they spoke about the estate accounts, and sometimes about other things. And the horse walked beside them with its breath white in the cold air, The gloves wore well. She had expected as much. He had chosen them carefully, and careful choosing lasted. Spring came late that year, but it came. The lanes opened. The first shoots appeared along the kitchen garden wall. The account books balanced to the pound, the first time in 4 years, which Bartley confirmed with a satisfaction that was very nearly emotion. Miss Ashford came back from Culford with muddy boots and a letter that made her laugh aloud in the office doorway. Nell filed the year-end reconciliation on a Tuesday morning in March, set it on the Duke's desk with a note in her careful hand, and went to stand at the east window with a cup of tea while the morning light came in. The grounds below were the color of new grass. The lane was empty. The copper vats in the old laundry were used now by the new laundry staff. 2 women whose names she knew and whose supply requisitions she signed, and she thought about them sometimes with the specific feeling of a person who has not forgotten what the work cost. She heard the door behind her. She did not turn around immediately. She had learned to take a moment with the morning. When she did turn, he was standing in the office doorway, reading her note, and the light from the east windows was on his face, and she could see the scar over his eyebrow and the gray of his eyes and the particular set of his mouth when he was reading something he was pleased with. He looked up. He said nothing. He did not need to. The wool gloves were on the window ledge beside her tea. She had said yes in January, and the world had taken its usual time to adjust, and the mornings were longer now, and the estate at Culford was Miss Ashford's and would remain so, and the account books balanced, and a woman who had stood in a laundry passage in November and heard something she was never meant to hear had found, in the plain arithmetic of telling the truth, a life that was entirely and irrevocably her own. Thank you for staying until the end. If Nell's particular kind of courage moved you, leave a word in the comments. She would not have asked for it. That is precisely why she deserves it.